Welcome back. So in the remaining time that we have this morning, I want to turn your attention to a few more really interesting aspects of hearing and that we haven't talked about yet.
단다 투절 하마지 요라쇼게 조데 니바디나가 다 투절 더 제야 케네치 니르 카시지 마트웨 이스.
And one of the things that is really challenging in the auditory system is to understand how we localize sounds in space. And that's the next topic I want to turn to.
지카르나 투절 말라 용조다 코에디 다 코에디 카네니 용구유메 조라 초코유메디 파나나네 콜 카네 용구유메 디감트웨 이스.
But before I do, I want to make sure that it's clear to you now that different sounds cause vibration along the cochlea, and that signal is transmitted to the brain along the auditory nerve. So are you all comfortable with that idea?
다 달구디 탐보 파넬리 아니 젤라 코알라 조르르다나 경왕들 조르르와스 데네 아니 토저 원자기야 니스 다틴디 레벨 키루요디 아니 조단디 시오 차스와스 상마.
Yes? Okay, good. So now we're looking here at the auditory nerve coming into the brain. And our auditory nerve travels, the axons travel to this region of the hindbrain that contains the dorsal cochlear nucleus on either side of the brain.
다단다디 왕자디 토저 왕자디 튕겨요 와스데니라 토저 왕자디 아니 젤 디 레베 갭 초드레스 디나라 단다 갭무 아니 교이 단다 교와 아니 데니 딜리요레스 디 다게 차틴디레스.
So remember that the auditory nerve isn't just one fiber, but it's millions of fibers, millions of axons that are carrying information about the frequency of sound, that are carrying information about whether it's a low, medium, or a high tone.
다단다 디 토저 왕자라니 디나 찌란지 때도와스 딜라 두걸 왕자 찌 마레스 디나 왕자 사이몽부 냠도요레스 다게 차틴디나 안 디기 가르키기요 라와나 다틴디 다마조 드라기 도슈 칸데 이미지라 다 토이나 마이나 디 니스 다틴디 킴두요레스.
And even though this diagram is only showing an auditory nerve coming from the left ear, there's another one not shown here that would be coming identically from the right ear.
다단다 디 왕자 토저 왕자 디 유네 용하시 된도와스디 초치 마시 된도와스 디 치고지간 단다 예 초라이 디 치고지간 주요레스 리무나 된마레스.
And they make their first synapse here in the cochlear nucleus, and then there's a second neuron that then projects across to the other side of the brain.
다단다 델라 다게 사린 딜렌 델라 투잠 지수도와스 델레드 투잠 쇠차이젤라 디야 왕자 타수디기 아니 콜리르 라와나 레비기 디유엔 로아스 아니 예초라 팔리요레스.
And from the superior olivary nucleus, there's a third neuron that then projects to the midbrain structure called the inferior colliculus.
다디 테닝 데네 아니 테즘 나데 투잠 지수 아니 데네니 왕자 타수디 콜리르 라와나 레베 파르마 파르차 주로 델리요레스.
And finally, then, a projection from the inferior colliculus up to the thalamus, the medial geniculate nucleus of the thalamus.
다딜 투잠 지수네 아니 디 왕자 타수디 콜리르 라와나 다게 차리디 타나마란수기 테기 항일레쇼 주와스 델리요레스.
And from the thalamus, there are neurons that then project up to the auditory cortex.
다단다 테길 항일레쇼 네 쿠이델라 양 투잠 지수로스 데네 왕자 타수디 콜라요 라와나 디 콜리르라나 다 투소 레슈주야 델리요레스.
So there are about 5 synapses between the information coming in on the auditory nerve and the auditory cortex.
다단다 데네 왕자 토저 왕자 네치네 아니 토저 레슈 버도 드웨조로스 디 드웨바라라 투잠 카조요 라와나 nga스 도와스티나.
And notice that from one ear, that information is projected to both the left and the right auditory cortex.
제자다 단다 디로차샤나 디네 다틴지리 요르와스 디 암주 용바디 차디 요르와스 요메 닐레 다틴디 델레 사요젤라 아니 네츠 다틴디 레베 리슈 단다 퇴솔리시 요엔다 예 니가라 두고 요레스 다틴디.
So this is very complex circuitry, and we don't expect you to memorize the names of all these structures in the pathway.
제자다 디 귤럼디 고뇨코 슈도 주레스 디 나로 차고 망부지도스 디 상마 킨조 lun지 최고에 네 차고 마레스 lun지 최고고요 마레스.
But it's important to know that processing sound in the brain so that we can understand pitch, different frequencies from low to high, and also where the sound is coming from, takes quite a lot of machinery in the brain, neural circuits in the brain.
딜로드다 카리 고츠고 라와나 한다가 저기 왕제 귤럼 라오라 지기jel지 니수드에 저라스 디 아니 망부 슈주 추요 레스티나라 먼저 되슈 토아르샤 마르샤 대주로 스터디 디 아니 하고 예세체라 니 디나라 망부 슈지 차고 망부 냠들라가 치요 레스.
And this is the other important aspect of hearing that I wanted to spend some time on today, and that is how we localize sounds in space.
디 탄당 아주 반낭니 아니 다디 칸데 리그요 메주라 디 칸데스 하고야 주라 디 아니 지케 좀 차기요 레스타나.
So this diagram is meant to depict sound coming from a horn. What do we call this? What is this special instrument, the horn? Ganglini?
Yes.
So the sound is coming from this to the monk, and the sound arrives at the ear closest to the horn first, and it takes more time to travel around the head to the opposite ear.
다탄다 디 강리니 다퉁고 로스라 디네니 아니 디 당보 암주디 유엔초드라디 유엔초드니 리기레스 투즈 고레지로스 유엔초라 도알레체 아니 유엔초라 마부르기레스 레라.
So part of that complex circuit that I just showed you, part of its role is to detect the difference that this sound takes, the difference in the time it takes to reach this ear versus this ear.
디 칸데스 하코투 레스타 암조 딜라다 디 응엘라 리기레스 디 젤라 리기레 주로스 투즈 케바 요라디스 디.
So those neurons in the brainstem can compute the time delay between a sound arriving in one ear and the other.
마란수이다 투즈 왕자 데웨 탄다 왕자 디주로스 왕자 투즈 코란수이다 지게 딘데로 치니아니 코란수이 투즈 하고 요레스 칸딩모나 리기요 다 칸디젤라 리기요.
And then partially through learning, our brain computes that delay, that time delay, and allows us then to know where a sound is coming from around us.
제자다 레베기 탄다 디지기아니 아니 다 칸딩모나 리기도 다디 칸디젤라 리기도 라나니 요치 투요레스.
So this is another important ability that we have with sound, is that we're very good at localizing sounds, particularly when there is a longer delay between the two ears.
제자다 아주 다디 칸에 연구 이미지라 디 아니 켜슈 차드레스 아니 대한나시 코로니 파르달레 주라 암주 요다 요마 파라 투즈 카가스키 케바치아나 디가스 아니 요치 레라 차요레스.
And one of the other things that we do when we're trying to locate the source of a sound is that we turn our head so that we can actually be more accurate at finding the location of the sound.
딜로드다 다지 토어점 기타 데닐리도 삼반들 람상 고유고 요스 고유도 발디 카리핑고 라와나 다디 칸닐리고 메 딱다지 하고도 요스 파초다 와이나스.
So that means really that the auditory system is computing two very complex things. One is the frequency of the wave that we're hearing, that is the sound frequency, whether it's low, medium, or high, as well as the delay that it takes between the time that sound reaches one ear or the other.
다단다 다다 데오지 카리차죠 라와나 아주 되주디단 데오차기레스 되주 토아레샤 딩아레샤 마아레슬란 디체 안치디 다디 암졸레 kapso 되주 케바죠 라스 khandi khandi gel li amju ni gi kheba di gi chik chagi res.
And this afternoon in our activity period, we'll do a demonstration that, in which we show, in fact, that we're most accurate at localizing sounds that are coming from one side or the other, and least accurate at localizing sounds that are straight ahead of us or straight behind us.
Ta thari ningu jabla chego jiga ras di gyuni khari ha ko la wana chego di chinis tang zo dra di khani yungu me takta she jo ras munji thue di ani kesi dra di susu amjo thani ligyo nas ra amjo chon la ora da dini li thani ligyo na kera zo yita khawan ligyo me di takta she thu yo res ta dyun da gyab de cha sha na ani amjo ta dra di khani ligyo la di takta chila thu yo mares kha cha yo res.
So now I want to try to bring this information that we've talked about in terms of how we hear sounds and how we localize sounds to how that is linked to our ability to understand speech.
Tanda ngazo dadi dojo khande ime chen khane yume ligi yume jura di ani khare da teo chawul na ngazo keje she da yama pinju teo che di da teo peju chungu ros.
So what these diagrams are showing are activation of regions in the temporal lobe of the cortex when exposed to noise or to noise here or to human speech over here.
Ta thanda di parlen sha yu di khari ga jire lawana nale dama ju di ga jires andi gi khu khandi kuma the me jura ta di ro cha sha na di khar lana ke so da chimbu shu hu da ke so din ri khudu ga lani kuma the sha ju par jires di nam ju ke je she ga so ni kuma the ju par jires.
So remember, I mentioned at the beginning of the talk this morning that our ability to hear sound frequencies matches very well the frequencies that we use for language.
Di thanda ngaran sugi mi na nye ni sha na shi mi gi thanda docho khagas khugo lan se ji dos di ani khari da thungu yor la waina mara ju nam ju ke je shi yo speech la di da ani ta thungu res di docho ni di.
And interestingly, when we look using neuroimaging at the areas of the brain that are activated by sound, white noise or pure sound versus speech, we see a difference in the regions that are activated.
An thanda ngaran sugi par wangze gi par gya shawai nasra lebe khu din zo dila du bal di khare nam ju ke je shi yo gi ke je shi yo ka so ni lebe gi khu khandi kuma the me dires di nam ju dra chi dang gi dra de sob so ron lu shi do din de ka so ya par gya shi ju jires nam ju ke je mai ba da shi ba ni ra din de res di.
And language, as it turns out, human speech activates a greater area, a greater number of regions in the temporal cortex than pure tones or sounds.
Ta thanda ngazo di dan du wai nas di nam ju dra shi ba den zo ros ani di ngazo ke je shi yo ka so ani ne ma khu ma kuma the yo res lebe gi thanda ne le shun dina.
So along with the ability to hear human speech sounds, other areas of the brain in the temporal lobe also evolved over the course of evolution that allow us to process language.
Ta thanda di nale le shun chi bu mai ba di lebe gi khu shamba den zo lai kuma the yo res kuma khu shamba den zo khari phing yo la na zo ke da la ro chi yo res din zo.
So just as the auditory cortex is present here in the temporal lobe, there's an additional area that is present that's specifically related to our ability to understand language.
Dila du thanda di khu di chi bu mai ba thanda le shun di nale le shun di cha de ros di na da le shun di chi bu mai ba khu shamba ne be ya khu shamba den yo res di gi ngazo ta ke da go chue la ni ro go phing yo res di.
And that area is called Wernicke's area, and it allows us to give meaning to particular sounds or words.
Dil ne ju da dila warni gi khu la yo res di ngazo khari yor la wana ke je di khatanda ta si do shi ros khari me go chue jo ros di tige di phing yo res.
This region, Wernicke's area, is connected to another region in the motor cortex that allows us to produce language, produce speech.
Di ke da go chue la phing yo res la ros di ani khari da thu dur la wana thanda di ani yogu relation di te cha dures di na ya khu jures di khari pingur la wana ngajugi ke da tuye jura di la pingures.
And that second area is called Broca's area.
And di niba jidwas di la khari la na broca e khu la jures.
So in some individuals, after damage like a head injury or a stroke, they lose their ability to either understand speech or produce speech because of damage to these two areas near the auditory cortex.
Ta gola da gyenchimbu do shodu gola megyo do sho ainas ra jaga da kangi de nishi de po ainas ani kabre khari lona neba dinzu phaju geja khari shwa de goma chwa che yana ko ina phala shema thue de kangi thius dila de kui dinzul an kyen shu res.
So in these patients, they can still hear tones and understand low versus high tones. They can still discriminate them, but they may lose their ability to understand language.
Dila de dinzu nebari de khari lawana da chejung da de chu khaga simi jora thole malwe dinzu samo kugu res khoya kugu res ine keda iri jora keje shidu dinzu khonzu ge go chutu yo mares.
So now we're going to do another demonstration that requires a microphone. And this is to demonstrate how our ability to hear can change with age.
Ta thanda de chego do chigyes dina khari tungur lawaina ngoju lo chero duras digo so ngoju gi khoya la khan de tozur de khali nyamgi yume jura di ta tewa chagures.
So as we age, I'm sure that you have tried to talk to some people who are older and notice that you have to speak louder for them to understand what you're saying to them.
Jigda keran ju binde thong de ras lo gemba de zula manju khunju gi kejo khoya la manju ke chimbu yaw ki dos.
And there are several things that can cause hearing loss as we get older.
Di khari da manju lo gero do du bala ani thanda thozor nyamgyo do di cha do res lo gero do di kin chi res chi.
We already talked about damage to those receptor cells called hair cells.
Manjuji kharil keje sheorla na phabyo thabung la megyon shoina ani thozor nyamgyor la sheorwas.
But another type of damage that can occur just through normal aging, not through traumatic damage such as exposure to loud sounds, is that we can lose the ability of those tiny bones in our ear to vibrate at very high frequencies.
Dila de thanda nganjugi ta dachimbu shuju ko ina thanda nganju phabyo thabung de kyo shur la oras di chubu mai ba ya thanda nganju lo chero do ina ge dil kangi thires di ani de shu thwa denjo ju khothu yo mares.
So this is a demonstration of a very high-pitched sound. It's a mosquito. And depending on how well your bones of the middle ear are working, you may or may not hear this.
Tadi tukdang kita tu shajus res tukdang aji. Andi kiran su kita parna di ruba di laga khandi chigyo me dil tani hagu rasa. Di dra di ko aina parna di laga yagu chigyo res.
You all heard it? Okay, let's try it again. So this is actually very hard for me to hear, which is why I'm covered with mosquito bites.
Chezanta nga di tudang ke di khoya khapu shu chayo dosa chezangi subul ta na tudang so ya jo kyanga res ta yo res.
So how many of you could hear that?
Kiranzo nani khaju ki kosung sa di. Tudangi da tunjo direla sa khaju kos. Only few.
Karma can hear it very well.
This slide was the.
But I have a hard time hearing it.
Ani gelaporan cha shawana khoya khabu dosti.
I also learned that on the internet, you can download this sound of a mosquito for your cell phone ringtone.
Ta thanda di tugrangi keji thanda draj tungu doas di ani thaya la draw ina di dradi ma pabya juya sosugi khabar na la le resti.
So that you can actually hear your phone ringing, but the Geshe La and the abbot cannot.
Ta dinde hindu bala ani khabar dina la khiran ji download chiyo inas ma le inas di tadi and ringtone do shagi yo han junam ju di shana ani khiran ju khu res ani khiran ju kimbo de ju khu mares khabar le waina.
And I'm pretty sure that my children have already figured this out.
Tanga hagu yes nge pu den jo ge di de chi yo res.
So this, just to summarize, there are a number of changes that occur with aging that make it more difficult for us to hear sounds. So one way that we can lose sound perception or have hearing loss is through damage in the conversion of sound waves into mechanical energy right here in the middle ear.
Ta thanda anjo thoso nyam dre joras chi khari gen shagyo lawana thanda anjo di jure joras di kharana dialog de khari jurgur lana nishu kushu nubal jurgu yas di jurma thu aina di kangi di thiyes.
And that can be caused by changes to these tiny bones that make it more difficult for them to move to vibrate very quickly in response to sound.
Diladu thanda di dialog di kushu nubal jurma thu kenchi khari shagyo lawana thanda di kengi ani thanda di rubasum jiwas di ani yogu chitu yo mares di yogu macho na dratun tu maras.
So when someone is hard of hearing, what do they ask you to do so that they can hear you?
Ta khunjo namju amjo yabu khu me ainas midin yo ros ani kiran solo khari chida lag dos na dam no shodas. Okay, they'll say come closer
Or speak louder. Speak louder, okay? So when we increase the intensity of a sound, when we make it louder, how are we changing the property of sound?
Tanganjo kecheru gadala no kecheru gago ros anjo diladu dagi kecheru khari gyo tangyo res.
Think back to what we talked about, the physics of sound.
Deshu khaji gore chero we are increasing the frequency of sound.
When we talk louder, we're not changing the frequency.
Kecheru gadu bala ra
Yes.
anjo deshu dilak gyo tangyo mares ulbang la we are increasing the amplitude.
We are increasing the amplitude. When we talk louder, we're increasing the amplitude.
Kecheru gadu bala deshu rangja ros khari cheru tangyo lawna keju di ulbang thoru tangyo ros.
So even though we talked about this for pure tones, speech is a mixture of many, many different frequencies. And when someone is hard of hearing, they may ask you to speak louder so that the vibration is greater here in the middle ear.
Chazata dad ke di cheru gadala du bala an gulbang che ros diladu ta thanda pharna dila ni darbu che di nimanga yu resti.
So this type of hearing loss is called conduction deafness because the sound doesn't conduct to the cochlea.
Ta thanda di thosor nyamjon dre judas di khari king gyngor la na gyudong ma chwa del ga di yorwas di king res.
The second type of hearing loss that we talked about is damage to the receptor cells, the hair cells, and they're located here in the cochlea.
Ta nyamgyo dre thosor nyamjon dre chik di gyudong ma chwa king yorwas chik di khari du la wa na anjo del phabu thabung yos dil kyun sho inas ani thosor nyamgyo res.
And typically damage to the hair cells is from environmental noises, loud environmental noises, horns, trucks, explosions, gunshot, loud noises in our environment.
Ta thanda di phabu thabung thola dre jorwas di khajin du la na aran khoryo gi king res ke chumbu ni ma da chumbu ni ma bu khu yorwas motor get the thanda kon dunga do da dhana shi bizo ni menda shue da de ta chimbo ndu khugu ras digi khoryu gi kenge ani di thola du res phabita bondi.
So in the United States, young people like to go to music concerts.
Ta thanda shena thapde ndi chi doas dinde la thanda ari do cha shona shunshwe mangcha del dra go chi res zonggu da zom ni she do shena thapden che dinde.
Particularly rock music.
Nikke chimbu shu thanda roja da chimbu shu lungi de kunzu rokash li do dinde la go res.
And the music is very loud at these concerts.
Ta denzo gi thanda she tang gi ros roja denzo da denzo chimbu shu res.
Sometimes several hours of loud music at a concert can cause damage to the hair cells.
Ta thanda thuzu ringbu thanda dinde chosa jura de la tang wainas da chimbu de thuzu ringbu nyen di gi ros di kenge ani thanda ngazo thuzu nyamgyo dra di kangi di tigi res ni di.
Or listening to music through earphones from your cell phone.
Thana shong zo khabar ni earphone gyuni nyingi yos.
Which is why you don't want to turn the volume up very loud when you're listening through headphones.
Ta thana ngazo amju gyuni nyingi yos khabar ni di nyendu bala khenzo kechimbu shu tang maros chiba amjul kyun chi ros di.
And there are also certain drugs or medications that can sometimes have the side effect of damaging the hair cells.
Thana ji phabu tabung chi khoryo gi kengi kechimbu da chimbu denzo gi res larwa chi phabu tabung khadu thula kyun shur lawaina main de sawainas digi ani surbo li do dende gi ani phabu tabung di thula du res.
So engineers have developed a way to treat sensory neural deafness using a device that can stimulate along the basilar membrane.
Dila juta phabu tabung di thula do sarwas ina dela tana ngazu kujen te thya yores kujen di khol tigu lawaina ngazu shigi jiyo ras nim kimo jiyo digal tigu yores.
So there are some children that are born that have a mutation that causes the hair cells to fail to develop properly.
Ta pu khashe la tande kedu khorani kangi yores di ta thugyon do jores di kangi di kharu lawaina tanda phabu tabung di chalong yabu chiyo mares tinjunala.
And it used to be that these children were raised because they're deaf. They were raised using sign language.
Ta phabu tabung lya ma chu du gala ta umba chabi ras khugu yo maras che dinde kangi du gala khunchu gi ngajo de subu gi da te dang juya chugu den pheju chini dinde lap gi res pugu den.
So now it's possible to have these deaf children begin to hear again using an electronic device that stimulates at different places along the cochlea.
Ta thingsa inda imba ina pugu din chu ngajo thuje chunju de yoje din chu pheju chini tanda ngajo kimo de la kuyen che resla ras di ani tanda chowang ju ras di ne kha masala di yoje di shay res di yoje shani kuyen tani ani khojo khotu yores.
Unfortunately, these devices are still very, very expensive, so not that many people can be treated in this way currently.
Ta ina di chotab ji dos di khabu chagi res mi mangbula khaina na di yoje ju ras thuje di khongchmu shu res.
And then the third type of deafness is central deafness, where there's actually either caused by a brain injury, such as falling off a bicycle, a motorcycle accident, or a stroke, that can damage the central pathways involved in hearing.
Ta di tanda wene chi khari kyungi wor lawaina anjo dabgyun shu dos level la dabgyun shu di megyo di kingi res di la dugal anjo kangor tangde dabaina re thana shi baba tangde dabaina re motor dabaina re dinde kingi level megyo yong si ros di kingi ani chi wene di phogu res.
So let's I'd like to go over the vocabulary terms and a summary slide, and then I'd be happy to take any questions you have about anything we talked about.
Ta di jela tanda thangye de ju thangye kha de tisha dos di che di jela ni ningdu jura di dres di thama de la ni thotile ma ko is. Ta thangye na la khari khar dula na chi na do ani ne puga nanga harsha ale ngaki yana pharna do ani pharli rupa ani kyowang phabu thapung 시기 퇴제 왕자 아니 퇴절기 ngarim lesion.
And then this is a summary of everything that we have discussed today. Do you want to read it?
다 다른 가리 드로잉 발록티 치웨게 다 닝도 디디레스 아니 다시바니 랍타부 주슈 치기요밤 네 나우투 슈데 네 부바니 나가 라큐기요스 아니 다이 니바이 나가테 dargu cheba kwelche ani dargu thegi nange gap tu chabe parne ruba shebe ne ruba chungun nam yugul cheba kenches gawe kengi ruba chungu tenzo tebo chabe teda yugul chegi mes te tozor lawe ken chegi yes ani parne ruba namgi nangane kyowang par gushu nuba khare gyudong ches 교환이 무베부 꼭다불 지다키베 쉐구 캥베 뇌지긴스 바네 루베 교환기 고르베 샬랍낭 슈 카레 규동 체기여스 다시기 되쳐라 떼데 랍테 교환 유데 카레 강타 리와 통화시도 껴버라 chela the nang yobe kimor dargu thep sujus yugu thela tene shigi di yobe habun nam ngar longke to jungne wangse chimba lebar chejing thoje wangse nangi wangza chasu tidale le suju bache thoje wangza thagi legang nangi mixe wangza chasu nangi teng wangse chimba phenlegi gone Haredi. Dai doche korgi nesu pe warches.
So I'm told that this is not very clear, but it's all in your handout.
Ta thanda dinala seu shira mendwa sine thanda kiran zuma shogun atam shegyodi yigi seu dos. Computer loga radi.
Is it clear on your handout? Yes.
Ti kiran zo shogun ala seu doesa yigi de. Yigi tsig mendwa chiga chig tsam mendwa.
Okay, so I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about anything we've discussed today.
Ta terin zilo tiro di nganzo chodur chewe nalani di dan dewe tiwa yo na ni tiwa ko ches.
Ta dandi tutsur ngarang license ya jingdoa. Te tam tonsur ngarang license wa nikate sacha chiga yo re kaka chin yo res. Tutsur ngarang license ya jingdoa. Tutsur ngarang license
Tutsur ngarim leshu ma dida
muk olat du tonsur ngarang license nifting da wa.
Tonsur ngarim leshu lejua dini ne chigre loga res. Okay. So you have talked about primary visual cortex and today you talked about primary auditory cortex. Are these two located in the same area of the brain or in different areas?
So if we view the brain from the side, this is the frontal lobe, this is the occipital lobe, parietal lobe, and temporal lobe. You can see that the primary auditory cortex is in the temporal lobe. The primary visual cortex is in the occipital lobe.
Ta thanda di leber ros di lebe gicha hari cha dolan dinda bires di kyartak di thanda takdab dirwa an thana shi di an sukdab dires di wadi ani nale nadab diras ani thanda nganju gi thosor gi leshun jorangarim leshu di tawaina thanda di nadab der dos nale dama joras telo yores ani nganju thosor gi thanda leshun joras ngarim leshu di khoyor lawaina thanda takdab telo yores.
Outside of the primary visual cortex, there are additional areas, 4 or 5 additional higher level visual areas. And one of them, area V4, is in the temporal lobe. And it's very specialized for analyzing aspects of vision, including color and shape. And I also told you that at the base of the temporal lobe there's a special area that processes information about faces. So those visual areas are located in the same lobe as primary auditory cortex.
tanda tuzur gi ngarum le shu la di zo hwa cha de la na ara zo tak tak de yor was di la nem be tanda turim gi tanda nga zo ni su yerim yesil che ju yor was le shu di mai be ya di la nem be ya tanda nga zo tongzo da de cha gi yor was le shu di ge ko yor la na this is V4 or 5
V4 and 5 are in there.
ta tanda V4 the V5 la di tanda nga zo di tongzo da de le shu yor was nem be di tanda nga zo nada de le yor es di gi khari phing yor la na tongzo nga zo khado da ib yewa che yor was di la phing yor es an theana shi dewala tanda ta murgon dama juras di wala cha shoina thi del khari yor lawana ngo dong ya yewache ngonjin chi thue juras di yese chi yures.
So this stream of visual information is part of the what is it pathway. And there's another stream coming from V1 that moves in this direction with areas for processing where something is in space that we see.
Tangazo di tongsor da dewe shi yuras tanda di gulam juras di gi khari gi da thi yese chi yur la waina mobu di khari image yuras di gulam di chad yures yese chi sari ani thana shi mobu di khawa yor la juras di gi da thi di yama yese chi di gulam di chad yures.
And the cortex is full of fibers that connect different brain regions to each other and different sides of the brain to each other.
Dila dita tanda ngazo lebe koran cha shawana di nanglo tanda tsagyu deni mangbu yores. Di ani tsagyu denzo tharing denzo ki ani lebe ne chik ni shimba thuye jura di chik yores.
So even though we can see in the absence of sound and we can hear in the absence of vision, most of the time we are combining that information in our cortex and using it to navigate through the world and to interact with individuals around us.
Tesa di ke ngazo amjo ka bainege migi nesu di lentu doas thana shimi ka bainege ani amjo gini nesu di lentu yoras di ani nesu di bini ani lebe di le hadi du yores.
Di the druggy drug the lot of the ni drug lot of pan drug di amjo gi no lo gas na ngaju se jdo telpa do di drug lot the drug telpa do di tel the should develop an indig jolo ro no jdo killing gi jote on di ni digi juni pan do di drug pet ono tension la shi se ni ke la bon ye che on di drug so to le la killing di drug lot the no bon no pa te on di ngaju se jdo telpa do ba do yo do chu ni se do de se do ya de yo re ya mar sira pena ngaso
Dry love di phal li yoras sul chik li yoras la ni.
do ba no je yo se do shu se do de yo se do ya de yo re ya mar sira
So khari do ya na.
어서 다쳐요. 다쳐는 것은 아까 정디 다치는 새 도야 돼. 어디 열이 요 말이지. 배전을 가서 내가 차이 것이 어디 가서 도슈지 게지도. 다슈까지 지태고 있는 나도 도출레스도. 딜레바이나니 너무 판 로에기 tinsolation ya tiege dadwa chung ro re kan so re sira
Kisi data setda tapcha ro di yo ina swa yo ina ni di nichu di churu ro res la ra
kan yore yo mare sira 아니 drug lot 한 로에 데코 자기 가성에 마기 가서 나서 미기 지도와 민으로 미기 갔는데 왜래 너지 일라데 나도 logging all the chibare yana for zujena ji los ji doye ni poye ni jira kan ji les lot da drug lot zujena ji ti ti dane ba doye ji ni to the doye ni ra ne de kan ji les la
chu ila bi mai na dra dos chi jela di ro ni dai lab di sugjen reverse la ra. So there are two questions. The first one is when the sound wave reaches this eardrum, it hits, right? So is there an opposite force which is acting on this sound wave, like an echo? Is there some kind of echo produced there when the sound wave hits the eardrum? And if it's so, he feels that the information will keep on decreasing until it reaches visual cortex.
No, I don't believe there is an echo. So it's because there are high pressure and low pressure. The wave has regions of high air pressure and low air pressure. That is sufficient to move the eardrum, but it doesn't move a large amount, it moves a very tiny amount.
Ta thanda di lab ji ligi doas di ta nu shu lan ke ji shu ras nu shu tho da ma la ni di ani thanda lab di shu chum shu yo mares di ga ani thanda na gi dil thu ras di thu du gala ni shu gu jo tang yo mares gu jo tis tang yo res.
And the reason that we can detect those small movements is because these bones act as amplifiers of sound. So they amplify the sound by converting tiny movements here to larger movements at the opening to the cochlea.
Ta thanda dine le di chunju ma shio mares la ra gujo ta di tis mesh tang yo mares ta ine di nanga dil khari thu de la na ruba chunju den thu de ras di ruba den zo manzo khari na amplifier lan chunju ni chimbu suya jo ras di ke shi gers thanda dina khari ke shi lan dar ras dar chunju di dil tang du gala chero tang yo res.
I didn't talk about this, but there's a mechanism inside the cochlea for preventing very large movements of the membrane inside the cochlea. So we have some protective mechanisms to help protect us against damage. But for really loud noises, that's not enough.
Cheza da chimbu in dile wa nas ra chini tang azu thanda nge le she mes thanda kimo ju yas kimo di korangi nanglo la cherim din zu to ni thanda gujo shu tang yo na di kaya jura de ni sungyob che di niba di yo res ine da hachang chimbu shu le wa na an di le ga chi du yo mares sungyob che di.
Okay, there's a question here, and then we'll take the question in the back.
Chik de yinsa.
He has 6.
tanda de kan tanda tuso mala she ud sambo mazo chi na wan yage karzrta tuso wanza bodle tensang ra nga she so tensang man ra ne nga she so tanda tensang man ra ne nga de chile man ra su su yurga jibano ores.
So when you talked about the like auditory information which goes to the visual cortex, there were 5 synapses, right?
Auditory cortex. It goes to the auditory cortex.
Yeah, auditory cortex. There are 5 synapses. So are there different functions at different synapses? Or how does it work?
Yes. So I'm not an expert on this pathway. I'm not an expert on this, but I do know that for example, in the inferior colliculus, there is a map of sound frequency. And again, there's a map in the auditory cortex. So one of the important functions is to maintain the map of tones from this structure all the way up to the auditory cortex. So in each of these structures, there's a map of sound frequency or tones.
Tatanda di gulam joras di rotan dende galanga khewa and remains ra hine khari haku lawaina di gulam na la koran ju dine ni khari nya de lawaina pasara do nelu do joras thanda duche khande ligi me jora di nelu di de la nya go res di ani lesu datin di ya ani tozor lishun tang go res.
In addition, there is a computing that's done here in the brainstem in the olivary nucleus about delay, the time it takes for the sound to reach one ear or the other. And that comparison is computed here.
Ta da dile du bol mazugi tuzu tagi was amjo yeba ni lejo da yome lejo dinye para tuzu kheba yome yawa chingi di ni di ko khwi di ko cha de la na di lesha gi khwi di cha go res delani yawa di chi es chi res khandi mo li du khandi jel li du lejo ras.
And so just like in the visual system, the superior colliculus is very important for turning our eyes and our heads towards an object. The sound delay information is used in the inferior colliculus to help us localize a sound around us.
Tangazo di dadi khane li du chi ko sam di lam sangazo tagi was di tay di la khari finger la na ni dig finger res chago digi.
So this part of the brain, the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus, work together to help us orient our eyes and our heads and our bodies towards objects and sounds in the world around us. It's very important for orienting.
제가 차시 디다 디니도 디니기다 다디 카넬리고 메타야다 안조 포니타 요로스 무조 카조테 조라스 디다 아니 계중부 차기 요레스.
And that visual information and that auditory information is combined in the inferior colliculus in order to control muscles and posture and our eye movements so that we can orient towards sounds as well as towards things that we see in our periphery.
다 통솔다 다sur기 다친데 줄리기 요로스 디니가냠도 콜 두고르라나 델 두고레스 델 두니 아니 먼저기다 미 요구 치야다 수부 요구 치야 조로스 파 다디 카넬리고 메타야디 딜 핑 요레스.
So you can see at these low levels already the visual system and the auditory system are working together.
다 단다 델타 와나 마림도 차도라스 데 임바이나게다 마림기 네딜라 카리어르라 와나 먼저 통솔다 아니 퇴솔니가 냠도 두고도 왔으나.
Another example of that is at the level of the cortex. Remember I told you that there's a large region activated when we hear human speech.
아니 그런저 튕기도 왔 레슌기 차 단다디 쿠이 델라 가지기 파주 미지 깨제시어 고데와이나스 아니 쿠이 디 꾸마티기오라스 쿠이 따와나 쿠이 침부지레 차고도 왔으니디.
And these regions also become active when we read. So when we read the written word.
다디 암주 깨제시어 암주 고장기 디 꾸마티기오라스 대하나시 먼저 이길로고 요아스 베자다 대변주 로도발라 한네 대하랑 꾸마티기오레스.
But in that case, the information first arrives in the visual cortex and then through synaptic connections activates neurons in the auditory cortex that respond to human speech.
이네 태블로에 저라 디컵스 당보 네츠디 카넬리올라나 통솔 레슈니 네츠디 안 파탄기오레스.
ngaran so ni tukbolo pickups drateni tu in the city chitapyo amara te medit ni tukbolo pickups drateni tu in the city chitapyo amara medit samba ne nekeptela teacher lesson da te dan de vacansa tragedy lega chegyo amara sira kasinde dan teacher lesson de da te dan de vacansa tragedy ta lega chegyo baina aninga zu drati in the city chimataba karis.
So his question is, in deep sleep, does our auditory system and the neurons work or not? And in deep sleep, when we are in deep sleep.
Yes. That's why loud noises can wake us up while we're in deep sleep.
kuguyorres di dishedi kigyorres di yinsa manzo nyende kapsu ni tubu imbaina dachimbuji koin anzo ni sigdos. La. But when there is low sound, we are not able to perceive it. So during that time, does our auditory system works or not? Is it working or not? And the neurons as well.
As long as we are alive, our auditory system is capable of processing sound around us. We can be alive and have damage to the auditory system, in which case we would be impaired at hearing sound. But as long as we are alive, our auditory system is capable of transducing sound into electrical impulses.
Tanda karishiu lawana mazu sembo yimba inasra ta wangza tanda tozo da de wangza sama yulam jura lega chi tuye gi nuba yores panin daj lewana nisu di esel chini logda tuni ya nisu ya ke jura lebala di chi yores ta kisi dabgyon do sho ni thola droinas chago khashi thola do da dinde chashi thola droina ni nisu ya le tong maras shimba mazu sembo yimba che ani kyen khegu ji mewana nisu esel che di khatu na chi di yores nuba yores.
Can you repeat the question?
So he's saying, in a very deep sleep, when we are in a very deep sleep, even if the other person calls our name, we are not able to wake up. We don't hear it.
Yes. So, okay. Now you're asking a question that has to do with attention.
takiran chiwa di thanda khari da dewa chagdulana thunang la yila cheba juros yila cheba la dil dewa chagdus.
And one of the parts of the brain that's very important for consciousness, being awake, and being attentive is the thalamus. And we've only shown you connections from the medial geniculate nucleus up to the auditory cortex. But remember, we said that there are connections from the dorsolateral geniculate nucleus to the visual cortex.
Tatanda ngaran chogi ni se tat di sangbu yo kapsu longora dinde kapsu ani manjogi lebe chashi khandi dewa chagyor lawainas ani di chagyor res lebuk di ani thanda dina kharityo shayur lawna medial lana phar di chagyor was ali thanda gonda di dirsha thegi remendo phar girish langi lesho phar gilangi lesho ni ani thanda di thozur lesho na du doas di do ani khiran ju chik thing doas dela ani di wala tanda dorsal lana gyamwe chola tanda langi lesho chigyor was dini nisu nan lesho na du res di maimbe.
And also, when I talked about the somatosensory system, we saw there are connections from additional thalamic nuclei to the somatosensory cortex.
And di ganga tanda nganzugi luzur da dewe shedu gala ya di la nembe ya tanda ngaranzugi langi lesho shimbaji sheswas dini ni nisu di datin dinzu ya lesho tangi yorlan sheres.
So our sense of sight, our sense of hearing, and our sense of touch all are mediated through this structure called the thalamus.
Cheza lusur da dewa inare, thosur da dewa inare, ani thonsur da dewa inare, dinzu sangme gi tanda nisu di khani ligor la na lebu la ligor ras, lebu la lebu ni phatu ras, datin dinzu.
And each of those separate nuclei project up to a separate area of the cerebral cortex.
Ta tanda lebu la lewa imba inage koran sugi tanda tening dinzu loga chadu ras. Leshu dinzu loga ras, and dinzu rere gi ani tanda nganzu leshu la tangdu gala yan leshu gi kui loga la tangyu res.
But it's not a one-way street, it's a two-way street.
Ine di langa di chok chik rang dungi roji chagyo mares, chok nigal dungi di chagyo res.
So the cortical neurons project back to the thalamus as well.
Tiana shi leshu la yuwe wangza tasu yorwas, di ani ya ma tanda lebu la tugyo res wangza dinzu.
And it's thought that those projections from the cortex back to the thalamus are what tells the brain to pay attention or not.
Ta tanda leshu ni ma lebu la lingi wangza tasu yorwas, di gi nesu khari tigyo yorlawa na tunang chigure la yila chigure la di nesu datin di tangyo res.
So our cortex is constantly monitoring the activity coming through our sensory pathways and directing our attention to something in particular.
Dila du dine ne nesu le ani digi ma khari kuma tangyo yorlawa na ani khawala ngazu tunang chigudu la joras di nesu diragyo res.
And it's thought that during sleep, this cortical projection back to the thalamus in some way becomes less active.
Chesa nganzu ni kuwe kapsu dine ni ma nesu tangye jorwas di ani tanda nganzu gita lega che keji shio na tis nyunga yo keji shio res.
It's like a train that has many cars. If you disconnect the cars, then then information or the train won't move.
Ta tanda pesu shawa na mekor do shana digdos. Ta mekor jil mangbuji khangba do chig jil chig thu de ros. Loga dos di ma pi shona ne su chig di shimbal do thu yo maras ti ro res.
So whether we're in deep sleep or whether we have anesthesia for surgery where we're unaware of things around us, or if we have some other reason for loss of consciousness, the cortex is not telling the thalamus to pay attention. It's as if it's disconnected functionally.
Ta chele gi gyuni keji shio na tanda di leshu ni ma ne su datin ta jorwas di jam shawa do ta di ni gi thuga di lawa do chagyo res. Di kharshin rela na kabring onzu tanda marajo gi demand ndi kya dos tindi gi kengi yong sing res yana ngonzu ni tobu khwe kapso di che ani khashe takgyon shoi gyuni tindi yong sing ros.
So even though
tanda thimba gi do tindi kapso.
So even though we're asleep and information is coming into the brain as it is when we're awake, we're not attending to it when we're sleeping because our cortex has functionally become disconnected.
Tatanda ni kuya kapsu nesu dai nesu samale lesu le liyo restra ina lesu ni mata ya joras di chele di ta jo chele gi cheni ke je na ta thuga di lawdo tinde ji chayo res.
It's a good question.
Choya budus.
나로 좋아 가리는서는 다다 아니 drug 라지로 아니 drug 라데 아니 롱전에 아니 로그라고 도왔어. 아니 드는 로그이나 페나 라 drug 아니 다다 나로서 베 카본다오지 동아이나로 카본다오지 동아이나 다가로 다다 베 드니 아린 카본 동아이나 까체치 노로리아 다가로고 까체치라고라 베 조세 통보 시위지 동 로그도 상도스라 아니 drug 전 로그이나 아니 가르스나 베 조세 가르사 다다 조세 아니 왜 노인 다니 조세 다 뉴체라고 다가 뉴네 다니 던지 통도 디 가사니 디 라죠로 올라 다니 뉴체 조세 아니 왜도 체주 뉴체 가서로 그랬어
카바르타에 갑수라 카바르타에 갑수 다디 교고슈 루도 아스틸라 두가 로비 뉴르세도 도스라 통고 도스 교고슈 도스 데시 칸데 레스 Doeguling line be gyokse line. Gyokse khande yores khabar ta kapsura.
Se pena Losel ndong yes tani dash draw in the Tibarol yar be dal no long ba jiwara yena tes go do as. Tada khabar ta be kache chi no yan juba shimro do as. O did ane kalsa o nyuse khande blores.
So when you talked about sound, you said it has to travel through air, right? So when someone from the main temple makes a sound, it takes some time to reach here. But when we call someone in America via phone, mobile phone, so this sound reaches at the other end so fast. So he feels like it's at the speed of light. So could you tell us what is the speed of that sound, which goes on from one phone to the other?
Right, so I can't tell him precisely the speed because I don't know the exact speed.
Tadigi gyokse khajure lawaina nga takta jilla tu mes khailana di gyokse takta dingi shing mes khajoi bade.
Does he believe that the sound is traveling through air when he calls his family in Tibet?
The kiran di thingi dolas ta phele nami kiran nami phele dugal khabar tang ruas di dra de ani lungi juni duwe resam gi doesa.
So how is that sound arriving in your phone?
Kiran khabar na dra di khande ligi res. Logi juni duwe resam gi dos. Ra logi juni. Logi juni. Logi juni. Logda juni. So he feels that it goes through electrical signal.
Yes, and sometimes it goes through a satellite.
Covering on the sungar yuras kala sungar tinde ni dugu yuras.
So electrical signals from a satellite then are conveying that information.
Ta dini di logda di ya sungar lodo an sungar di ma tang yuras.
And then the electronic circuit in the cell phone has to convert those electrical impulses to sound frequencies that then are processed by our auditory system.
Cheza khabar di lewa khar chiyur lawana logda lejo di manzo danda dai lab la ma tungu yuras. Di twinsa ni dai lab di du manzo khotu yuras anjuli.
And so it's probably because the electrical signals are transmitted through satellites and then back down to the earth that sometimes there's a delay.
Covering on Zutanda Logda di Dinia, Sungar Lodo, Sunga Nima Lechiguras, di Duela, and cover di Chigures, Tuzu Porgures.
Drug di shote Chetanga so Miko Marskindua. Nitig Yanimato, Nitig Manchimato Gogomarskindua. Then I say, Dracora Chetanga so me Mako at the New Younger Maris. That Korang Tayado Chetana. That's a me Mako at the New Younger Maris. tanda drag desho chetana ngasi mi ma go maresate te ngasu nagina ti niwandu tholaga tawala tene mako arebe niwa tawa ne meso ares
Tama di kharsung be chidru bisung.
di desho te chetana ngasi mi go mares kindwa
No di the pos and di jalata chimbu jille oina ngazu khotu wrestling ra and di jedi.
di desho te ngase chetana mako ate tagarsa di chowain na chi sekindwa chopa chopa nalo na chi wapi tsapun na chi sekindwa tsatan wapi tsatan sate yo yongu niwa chimbo yo mar chi sekindwa ya tande ngatsute drag desho mako ate ngatsute ra drag desho te niwa tsawa ne me songarebe yamana koran ke desho te tsre yoma late ne drag koya ke te niwa do thola ga ta res
Jai dojo di len tu yo mare yana dojo di cheran thola ta resra.
tsre yona ko dalla tantring la koya ke niwa do thola ga ta songarebe
So you said humans can hear from that particular frequency, right? It can hear the highest frequency of 20,000 hertz. So if it's higher than that, does it mean that it is damaging the hair cells, or does it mean that the hair cells is not able to receive that frequency? What is the reason that we are not able to hear such high frequency, higher than 20,000?
Yeah, it's the second. It means that the bones in the middle ear either cannot vibrate fast enough to convey that information to the cochlea generally. That's usually, I think, the main difference between species' ability to hear sounds. But it could also be the neural processing along the cochlea itself. So for very high frequency sounds, there isn't a one-to-one match between the movement here and the frequency. For very high frequency, there's a more complex mechanism used to analyze frequencies.
So it's because these middle ear bones are not moving?
It's because these bones can't move fast enough, in part. Yeah.
Tadi gunse kharshi udla hoina thanda di pharna juwas pharna na ruba yo pharne nubadi di ta dojo chimbu shujle hoina yogu di takta ji machiwa che yogu chigi yordes ine yogu di gidela shugen te jorwas di yogu dangu yo mares yogu che chigi yor yogu shu chigi yo mares di chibu mai bachan thanda ngajo thanda kyongwa yorwa di da ani dinan lagi ni chu dwela ide cha yores
frequency duchi sujine tini ba the tini kang ya chwa chumude ma
on the lar da dile le ligi yore lar ti hine di da digi dojo cherani tanda ngajo parna yuruba chdo di yogu tani shugen the oradi da di ma do was di yogu di dange juyo mares yogu shukchimbo ma the ekingi di ne su di ma ki yo mares dise len tese kare chimbo ke chimbo gulban chimbo dojo chimbo di kuyo marlara ani gulban chimbo yo kazu chejun keba yor wes la ra koyala. Okay, so we have we can hear sound within such frequency range. So is there a range for amplitude when we say that okay we are able to hear this range of amplitude? So are we able to hear very high amplitude sound?
Oh, very soft, very loud. Yes, in fact, yes. So in fact, there's a point at which when you increase the loudness of sound, we don't increase the firing of the neurons in the auditory nerve anymore because they're already firing as fast as they can fire. So there are limits to how fast the neurons can conduct action potentials.
Tanda nganzu tanda panini datinji li ruas dai datinji li ruas di le kingi tanda nganzu gi tanda leshuna yoege wangze tasu tenzula ani kumatheni tanda lejum ni batungi ruas di lejum ni batun lagi cheji yores wangze tenzula.
So loudness is generally conveyed in the auditory nerve by the frequency of firing, whereas the tone, the frequency is conveyed by the neuron's position in the cochlea. So frequency of sound is conveyed by a position of the neurons, the hair cells, along the cochlea, whereas loudness or amplitude is conveyed by how fast the neurons fire action potentials in the auditory nerve.
Tanda nganzu deshu da dewe lega chidan di khari chadu lawa na nganzu kyowang yuas digi nala wangza tasu denzu khande ne me jura dedang dil dilara ligu res an tanda nganzu da ta chimbu da chunju lawa dila du gala di khari ra ligu lawa na digi nala wangza tasu digi nala leju ne ba tuen juras di kyole khaga sume dila khebas di dewa chagi res.
So for hearing different frequencies of sound, what matters is where the receptors are moving maximally in the cochlea. And that's conveyed through a separate set of neurons. So this would be low sounds. If the hair cells are stimulated here, it's a high sound.
Tanda dechu ga keje shoina dechu mau yimbaina delir la ruas labde ani labde ringa du gala dele du gala digi ne wangza tasu denzo dadi ya ki ruas dike du gala ani dadi mau yo habu res an thana shi dechu toe kapsu ani dele li ruas labde dile du dele yo uchi ruas ani digi dagi chati digi ne chudi ya ki res digi khari habu lawana ani dadi mau yo habu res.
So neuroscientists refer to this as a place code.
Dilo do ta seriba kuranzugi onza seriba kharila go lawana ta ta gyasha na shiru dosti ne ta gyasha go ne do chagu res.
So for a low frequency sound that is very soft, the amplitude of that sound is conveyed by how fast or how many action potentials this nerve fires. So for very low frequency sounds, it might fire pop, pop, pop. For very loud sounds, it might fire pop, 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 pop. So it's the code that's carried in this fiber that tells us whether a low sound is soft or loud.
Tadi dechu juras digi ani nganzu gita dini ma da tandu gala tanda ma yundu gala an ma tandu gala this the roj dos tanda di leju ni ba ke je shoinas thana shi tanda dechu to ai bainas an digi tanda wangza tasu ni ma leju ni ba tuen juras di go res digi kenge an nganzu gita dama da ta to la ni ndi yawa chi gores ani thana shi ke cheo da chunga la ni di tanda ke cheo da chunga di kharil ra le na leju ni ba khagas tunge me juras dilata ni shin gores.
So then for a high frequency sound, if it's very soft, this neuron then fires pop, pop, pop. But if it's very loud, the neuron would fire more. Pop, 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 pop. So it sends more signals to the brain.
Tadi dechu to yembai na ge da de chimbu sharam me waina ani tanda wangza tasu genjugi tanda datang ruas leju ni badi di the res pop 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 na ta kisi dechu to ache ani thana shi da chimbu ji tumbai na sra ani di tanda leju ni badi do pop 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 na dogu shu leju ni badi dogu tumbi res
gena ge chowang jo chowang ma changba tele tne desi dun shelu chowang ya ancho na chowang se o te ma changba tele desi dun shelu te tangkat dun ngi chi she go ya karina Detin dün che yas.
This is dun che shas ma kyang du gala the khajini che res Okay, so when you stretched that cochlea, you have divided this into 7 segments. Why you have done that?
Why did I stretch it out?
Stretched it out and made 7 divisions. There are 7 sections in that, 7 parts. You have numbered 1 to 7, right, in that?
Here?
Not this, cochlea, stretched cochlea. This one. So there are 7 numbers, right? So why you made this?
So these numbers are arbitrary. They're not, there's nothing special about this particular 3 here. It's arbitrary.
The terasta the angita gasho is dil kate and then yo mares. Angita gajosh do di somebody di sungulan ke yo mares terasta gasho res. Then you go to the ma do your rose tungu do asta. But di somebody karalana di ke di yo mares tundaro.
So it's a continuous frequency map from very high frequencies to very low. It's not that these are particular, anything special about these. It's a continuous map of frequency, and very high frequencies, they're different. Depending on the frequency, it would cause the wave to stimulate different positions along the coast.
That under the net to end was chadu was the Diladugola, the Chuto Ledugola, and it Kwan Guinea Kandi, and it Laptungu made to rest. The Chuto and the Del Tungur was, the Chuma in the Gala, and Kwan Guinea, the old Tungur Lyre was, did to end the rest. But the Karilan mix a Kayo Maris and the Sumba the Dirilan.
So the numbers were just put in there in the textbook to help explain the frequency map.
The Duchu is Satra Laura, Duchu the Delalina, Toy and a Dela Ures, and Ma in a Dela Ures, Satra Quedo, Dig Children, Angidi, Tasta Gasha Res.
Okay, in the back.
Tandange chawad karin jade karin pandoya de dugi law jin doya ni kosonsra tindi imba ina ngen den ma kanma age de biji lawa ina ti ni de dugi jin do and an pasho nyenge de anjo nolo la ani du de potan da la eg du da bigi du potan la cheba ji yore yo mares an pasho te ge te eg du imba da te bigi du imba country ko res.
So when he make a sound like A, B, so the sound is different, right? So are there different particles for which hits the eardrum for A and B? Are there any differences between these 2 particles which makes A sound and which makes B sound?
Yes, there are differences in the, we call these phonemes, so ba, ta. Those are different. Those sounds have different sound waves associated with them.
Tadanda ba kalan tang so atadi. Di twindu gala dai lab lo yo res dinila.
Ni tu ate di pu chung chung to so la ngas phat da ta ne pu chung chung ke che shim shin to so do. To so la phat da ta ne ngas yalin sa tegum do. Ene korang ge mug so len thong ne ngas lak bag de che ne ku sre yong shi wa ta ngas phat da ta ne chu ni ku yalin te shigum do. Ti mixer ke ti tusur malak liga yo mare liga yo res.
Keche she matungi rob. Chunchu banzolo. Show khani show jibulana yum do sa.
Sir la na ku yong shigum do. Ani sar ku mugin thon de jine ku sir yong shig do. De na ku thonsar malak ti phari liga yo ni zo lo jig do. Ina ku tusur malak ti liga me ni zo lo man de ji thonso te kari je hes. Te na yong pogo so la de zini ngas tusur malak liga yo re.
So he said, like, when he tries to give instruction to a small baby, so when he says come, he won't understand, he won't come, right? Because he's not able to speak, he's very small. When he says come, he won't come, but when he does sign language, body language by showing like this, he comes closer. So he feels that the auditory system of the baby is not fully developed or is not working, and the visual system is working fine. Is that so?
The auditory system probably is working before the baby is born, but language develops over the first few years of life.
Tanda tozor malaj yorwas di pugu kedu ni yores tada ine khari yerge duwer lawana ngazo keda jda di ani khali khali pugu chunju ne ni tanda lo thangbo nyo sumba dinin khali yerge duwers.
So similarly, if you call a very small baby before it can walk to come, it could probably hear him calling it to come, but the movements it hasn't learned yet to crawl. So these language and learning to crawl and to walk take many years, whereas we are born being able to hear.
Kidu nida tozo mala yo cha sang yo che khoya sangma yo res tanga jo komba ye da yogu che da keda jira di sama ani khali yerge du res special no pu chunju shu jo no shola na le du maras en jela khali chero do tan chunju shu na khobo ye ga du maras kunjo khobo ye da ke je go chue da sangma khali keda de jo khali yerge du res.
In fact, young babies learn to recognize the sound of their mother's voice before they can understand what the mother is saying, and the father as well.
Ta tanda khari lagyo me ta gosu yo maras pugdi amada palagi ine amada palagi ke di go ha ko yo res mon jin thu yo res ko joi
ani tada dia atu de amjo di pan de lava kamera lava de sul de java ni de no tachia yo tachia yo gusra lava kamsa de tachia yo de garai.
So when you close this ear and when you bite something you na jik so jawa na ra and any chiwa okay when you do this on your teeth and when you and when you close this ear so you hear better from this ear where the ear is closed. Okay. So he said he cannot hear from this ear. So this ear is like deaf, he cannot hear. So he said like when he does this, when you do this, so he is able to hear better from this ear.
So we can conduct sound through our bones in the form of vibration.
Hanzo da tuen jorwas ding hanzo ani rube guni tuen jorwas dila dargu jorwa di shi yores.
So we have the normal auditory canal here, but there's another canal, it's called the eustachian canal, that connects to the middle ear.
Ta tanda ngazo dela nawe puga jiwas ti korshe saras di member ya puga shimba jores di puga dela thenge puga lan lagores di an kharil thu dior lawina parna dil thu yores.
And this comes out in the back of your throat, back of your mouth, near your throat.
Di khala chayar lawina ngazo tanda di mipa jora di gap dil yores.
So when you tap on your teeth, you're probably causing vibrations and sound waves to go up through the eustachian canal to the middle ear.
Chesan keran tanda so de inde dabar was ra chugu de inde chidu gola di ani antargu di khala care lawina di puguj dos diga ke ani di tra di yali yor was parna dela.
So that's probably why you can hear it. You may have trouble getting sound information in this way, but sound in your mouth when you tap your teeth can probably go up through this canal that goes into the back of your mouth.
Chesan keran namju deneni koer dagi tanda nesule di lentu mewa inasra tanda di keran di so inde chin dabar was tugui digi ani di tanda dargu gi kengi dadi ya tugui ki res.
좀 비노게 같이 니 지금 뭐지 그 정도야. 어떤 뭐지 돌아보세요. 이들라고
계란을 경험을 견딜라레스.
그거는 라나니다 에버테체다 에버도스.
안돼.
이때 아버지 그것도 인티마스 뭐기다 경험이
경험을 견딜. Okay, so he went to a doctor and the doctor said the problem is not with the eardrum, but the problem is in the cochlea.
Well, then I have no explanation.
The dinner in my nang adil dishe mesa.
Okay, so thank you, dear students, very much. We'll see Group A at 1:30 and Group B at 3:15.
The shela person chasra ani shela person jela ani chuju thangbo de chegala ani ruga thangbo de indasra an sum da chongala ruga niwa de